How the people are doing? So, well, I must say, this camera comparison, yeah, I've been really looking forward to this one. Now, this one is going to consist of a lot of daylight images. In case you caught the Mi 11 Ultra versus S22 Ultra camera comparison, well, there we focus more on indoor shots. So if you are interested in that, definitely check that video out using the link in the description. I think it's going to be very interesting, so let's jump right in. So for our very first image, I mean, it's pretty clear that when the lighting is good and you have good flagship cameras like these two, you're gonna get very similar results. I mean, sure, there are some differences, in saturation, contrast and all that, but for the most part, as you can see, I think there's a very obvious situation of a tie here. Moving on though, we have a slightly challenging situation in terms of white balance because this was during sunset, and I think I can very clearly say that the X70 is doing a better job with it. It is slightly on the warmer side because that's how it should look, and if you especially look at the sky on the S22, there's too much blue there. That's obviously not how sunset skies look, and at least when I took the photograph, the X70 sky is how it looked to my eyes. So I do think color accuracy is better on the X70, and generally in situations like these, it does do a really good job. Sometimes indoors the X70 can screw up, but outdoors the X70 can be quite immaculate. But now let's take a look at this HDR situation. So sun is in the background, lots of shadows to expose, and of course the X70 is doing a slightly better job here. The S22 is not far off, but we do see a lot more detail on the X70, and again the white balance is basically perfect on the X70. Up next, an ultra-wide shot. Not a very difficult one. I mean, it's not exactly a huge challenge for either one, but I do want to point out that the S22 Ultra looks really good. It's basically similar across the board and very accurate, just like the X70 Pro Plus here. But it does have an advantage, because despite the fact that the X70, technically speaking, has a more advanced sensor, the processing doesn't really take a lot of advantage for it. Because as you can see, there is like no sharpness being added on the X70 Pro Plus, which is why it just looks kind of lackluster when you look at the details. S22 on the other hand, it does have a good amount of sharpness being added, so there are some artifacts, but for the most part I do still prefer the S22 Ultra. Here's another ultra-wide shot in HDR situation, and here the white balance is actually inaccurate on both. X70 is too warm, while the S22 Ultra is a bit too cool. I think I'll pick the S22 simply because, I like the contrast as it's got going there, and add to that the fact that we get better detail. I think that's going to be my pick, but honestly you could really go either way in this case at least. Another main camera shot, this time with yours truly in it, and well, this is definitely a difficult shot. And well, the S22 Ultra is struggling with the skin tone here. You can see too much red in there, while the X70 is doing a really good job. I'd kind of expected that because, X70 can handle these situations quite well in most cases, and well, that's exactly what happened. Now let's talk about zoom. I mean, not much to talk about in the mid-range zoom region because 3x on the S22 and 2x on the X70 are very good. They have good sensors and you can get really nice, sharp and good looking images, as you can see. At 5x however, even with a fairly low quality sensor compared to the other ones that the X70 has, having periscope zoom or optical zoom rather, you can get really nice and crisp images. I mean, compared to the S22 Ultra's hybrid digital zoom that we are getting, the X70 does take a win. And I also want to point out that the colors look maybe just a tiny bit more natural on the X70. At 10x however, and anything further, it's basically the S22 Ultra's game. It has 10x optical zoom, and I think it's pretty obvious that the details look about 10 times better compared to the X70 here. And at 30x you can see that this is a spot where the S22 Ultra has very good and very usable zoomed in images, and going any further you're gonna see more artifacts and more processing and so on and so forth, but 30x is very usable on the S22 compared to just a straight up bad idea on the X70 Pro Plus, so do not go to 30x, you're not gonna have a good time. Now here's a close-up shot, and the reason I took this is because we had a breeze going, so I wanted to see just how much focusing is affected with that, and the leaves were just all over the place. But I must say both phones took these images in like the first 3, and basically they look really nice. I think the only small complaint I have on the S22, and it might be just because of the higher contrast, is that it is blowing out the highlights quite a bit in the background, but otherwise, it's really good on both. Now let's talk about high resolution. Now this isn't a very easy shot because as a lot of shadows that needs to be exposed, especially because the subject is in the shadow. So let's zoom right in and check out details. Also, I do want to point out the sky has a lot of magenta on the X70 Pro Plus. Zooming in though, and I think it's pretty obvious that having an extra 50 megapixels on the S22 is giving us a fair bit more detail. Add to that the fact that we have better shadow detail on the S22 as well. I think it's a very clear win. However, the X70 doesn't really stop there. We have 48 megapixel shots with the ultrawide camera on the X70 compared to just regular 12 megapixel on the S22. And zooming right in, the major difference here is that not only does the X70 go for a very natural route of not a lot of over sharpening, and that's precisely why it looks better in my opinion, because the S22, it has a lot of sharpening going on, and for the most part detail levels are similar, and there is a lot of processing that is very visible right up front, while the X70 has none of that. It just has normal or natural detail there. Now we can also take really good macro shots on these, and I think this is going to be a tie because both look just freaking amazing here. You can see very close with both of them. You can get about the same distance away from the subject, so it's not really much of a difference here. So let's talk about the front camera, and this is where I think the S22 is going to pull ahead, because this has been a problem on the X70 for a while now, but it's very inconsistent with the front camera, and quite often, like in this case, it can give you very desaturated and just washed out images that I'm not really a huge fan of. So I'm gonna pick the S22 here, and it's a similar situation here as well, because yeah, HDR shots with the S22 Ultra, I mean, that is very, very well balanced. I mean, this is one of the things that I really appreciate on the S22 Ultra is just the consistency that you can get sometimes, Like the previous shot, it was well lit and you had a really good contrast. This one has the sun in the background and we still have just perfect contrast and it's well exposed compared to what we're getting on the X70. So yeah, that's something I really appreciate. Now then, again in medium lighting, and you can see that it's very close. I do like the S22 again. It has more saturated skin tones and that is something I do prefer. I do think it has more red than I would really like, but compared to the more desaturated look on the X70, I do prefer the S22 here. Now we have a 40 megapixel shot on the S22 Ultra. Yes, we can take really high res selfies and it does look very detailed compared to the X70 Pro Plus. Like there is a lot of sharpness here. Despite the fact that there wasn't a ton of light falling on me, this is a very, very good selfie. And yes, there is a bit of magenta on my face on the S22 Ultra. Undeniably so. I do think the X70 is doing a fairly good job with skin tones. If you're looking for a very detailed selfie, the S22 Ultra is the way to go. Now selfie portraits, on the other hand, man, it's a mess on the X70. Sometimes it can be fine, other times you get these results. So, suffice to say, the crazy inconsistency on the X70 just gives the S22 Ultra a huge win with the front camera. If you do want good selfies, the S22 Ultra unquestionably is better, especially because it has good night mode selfie. I mean, I don't really have to explain anything here. We had a warm light, a really warm light, and even that is getting so well balanced by the S22 Ultra. You add to that the fact that we can take night mode portrait selfies. I think it's not even a competition. I think the S22 Ultra is one of the very few phones that can actually give good night mode selfies. But what about rear camera portraits? I think this is one of the features that a lot of people like to use, including myself. I like to take portraits of anything but myself, to be honest, but that's beside the point. In this case, I would say that the S22 is going a little too hard with the contrast. Not a huge fan of that, and by the way, I am using planar portrait mode on the X70. Sometimes, like in this case, it can give very beautiful results. You can see the contrast is just perfectly balanced, and I'm really liking the colors on the X70 as well. But sometimes the colors can get a little wonky, so keep that in mind. Now, well, zoomed in portrait, at least in this backlit situation, man, the S22 is nailing it. Like, this is a perfect shot from the S22 Ultra. I think the only thing that's missing are some bokeh balls. The X70 has those, but other than the bokeh balls, every other aspect is better on the S22 Ultra. So I think it's a very clear win. Now this shot here, not exactly easy to take because, the sun was straight in my face and I could hardly keep my eyes open, as you can see. And I think the big problem here is the same thing we saw in the previous shot where the sun was again in my face. Well, we get this magenta tint on my face and that really doesn't look very good. You can even see it on the road and everything, so I'm not sure why it's doing that, but I think the X70 clearly takes a win here. It's definitely doing a much better job with the contrast and the skin tones. I mean, this is planar portrait at its best in my opinion. Now for night mode selfies, I took quite a few of them because I really wanted to see which one was better. Now initially, at least in this case, the S22 is not doing a very good job because we have this crazy magenta going on. You can see it in my skin, it's on the road, and the S22 is also blowing out highlights. So that's obviously not a very good thing. The X70 on the other hand, it does have some processing artifacts going on. I mean, you can clearly see that there's a lot of processing going on here, but the X70 is definitely the better one here. Now this right here, needless to say, the X70 is doing a better job. I mean, I look like I spent like 24 hours in sauna and then went ahead and tanned myself right after that, which is why I'm basically a very deep red here. But yeah, the magenta problem is definitely present. I'm not sure if it's the lighting, but you know, the X70 is doing a very good job here, so I don't really see why that should be a problem at all. And yes, the X70 is quite bright. I mean, it is brightening up the sky quite a bit. Doesn't look very natural, but even then, I mean, the good skin tones, the really well exposed shadows, I think I'm still gonna go for the X70 here. Up next though, we have zoomed in portrait at night. And neither are doing a very good job. We have the S22 Ultra, which just went ham on the edge detection and messed that up. We also have magenta as our honored guest on the S22 Ultra. And then on the X70, it is a more detailed and just a generally sharper image, but it's too overexposed. Now, if I honestly had to pick one, I might as well go with the X70 because I know I can just drop the exposure in post, but let's be honest, neither are doing a very good job here. Now this shot, I only included it to show off just how plain up portraits can sometimes be very problematic. You can see that there's this weird halo on my face. Not very natural, not in the slightest. But you know, everything else about the shot is really good because we have good skin tones, we have good contrast, no magenta like on the S22 Ultra. So yeah, to be honest, even with the halo, I think the X70 is doing a good job. It is also overexposing the sky. Neither image is perfect, but if I had to pick one, I'll go with the X70 here. It's a personal preference. Moving on though, for normal night modes with rear camera, and I mean, here I think the S22 is doing a far better job. It still has magenta in there. I mean, you can see my arm, it looks kind of like a well done steak, but yeah, otherwise, I actually kind of like the saturation on the S22. Definitely looks better than the very flat look on the X70. But you know, skin tones in general, they do look better on the X70 here. Now another night mode shot with the main camera, and yeah, this was more to demonstrate just how blue skies can be on the X70 Pro Plus, and it is very, very blue. Like it looks ridiculous to be honest, but on the S22, despite having good, more natural looking sky, but you know, the color of the tree, for some very odd reason, has so much orange in there. Honestly, I don't really know which one to go for because the X70 has a natural subject and a very unnatural sky, and it's just the opposite for the S22 Ultra here. Now this night mode shot is a very good example of how these two phones have very different processing at night. So you can see X70, it just lifts everything up. I mean, there's no two ways about that. S22 on the other hand, it retains the contrast that we saw in the scene. Now, it really appeals to me, and I think it looks really nice that it does that. Now you do get more shadow detail on the X70, and that is how it goes. For me at least, I do like how the S22 looks here. Now this is a backlit shot, and it's very severely backlit that too. Both are doing fairly well, but I do think the S22 Ultra has way too much orange once again in the trees. I don't know what the S22 has against trees at night, but it's clearly not very nice. But despite that, the X70, it does not have nearly as much detail, and the sky once again, extremely blue. Now ultra-wide night mode, you know, this is something that the X70 just excels at. There are a few technical reasons for it. A huge sensor, incredible hardware stabilization, and very small exposures. You know, despite small exposures, like in this case, it took like 1 second, and you can see way more detailed than the 4-second exposure that the S22 took, and it also has better white balance. Same story here, you know, the X70 took this image in the first go because, you know, it's a very small exposure time that it needs. Having a large sensor really helps out here. S22 on the other hand took about like 2 or 3 seconds, and you know, the flower was so small that even in the slightest breeze it was moving and there was a lot of motion blur. That can be a problem in numerous cases, so having small exposure time, especially with the ultra-wide camera on the X70, you can get some fantastic shots. Zooming in, you can see just how much more detail is preserved on the X70 as well. You know, ultra-wide night mode, if that's all you care about, then you can just blindly go for the X70 and you're gonna get incredible shots through and through. Here's another ultra-wide night mode, and this once again brings up that processing difference. You know, more shadow detail on the X70 versus much better contrast on the S22 Ultra. Personally, again, I do like the S22. Now then, 2x on the X70 versus 3x zoom on the S22 Ultra. I think the X70 is doing a better job by lifting up the shadows. That does look better in my opinion compared to the very crushed look that we have on the S22 Ultra. At 5x zoom, however, I think neither are very good, because as I said before, the X70, it has a fairly lower quality 5x periscope zoom camera, and you'll see why that's a bad idea to use. So we're just getting digital zoom on both, and in general, you're not really gonna get very good results at 5x on either. At 10x though, yeah, see, this is what happens on the X70 Pro Plus if it uses its 5x periscope zoom camera. I'm not sure why it used it in this case. I can never get the phone to use the 5x zoom, but if it does, well, this is your result. And it's not nice, to say the very least. It took a 3-second exposure and still couldn't get any light in whatsoever. The S22, of course, it has a 10x periscope zoom, and yes, there was a little bit of wind, so we get some motion blur, but for the most part, you could say that you're gonna get way better results at 10x on the S22. Now then, for the moon, at 30x, I'd say both are just equally good. Maybe a touch more detail in some of the craters on the S22 Ultra, but you know, that's just the processing. It's not actually a shot of the moon, it's just being interpolated by the AI in the processing. However, at the maximum zoom levels, 60x on the X70, I think it just looks better compared to the 100x on the S22 Ultra. I'm not sure why it's so blurry compared to the X70, which is exceptionally sharp. I mean, that looks good. And you know, if I just had to pick one shot out of these two to post on Insta or anything like that, I'd pick the X70 any day. Now yes, we do get night mode styles on the X70. I'm honestly kind of tired of showing the same thing off over and over, so if you want to see those, check out the link in the description. It has many more camera comparisons, which do have a showcase of night mode styles. So, long comparison, I know, but you know, it was bound to be. This is one of the most interesting camera comparisons that I'm probably gonna do this year, or you know, until Vivo comes out with their next flagship. But regardless, you know, there are definitely areas to improve on the X70, especially with consistency. There's the front camera, and finally the 5x periscope zoom sensor. Jesus, that thing needs an upgrade, a big one. The S22 on the other hand, I think the consistency is very good on the S22 for the most part. Sometimes there is a lot of magenta, as you saw there. I mean, you could argue that the magenta was very consistently present, but it's not exactly a good thing. So yeah, there are definitely areas to improve. I think it's mostly going to be tweaks that can happen with software updates, at least I'm hoping. The S21 Ultra last year had a very good treatment of software updates from Samsung, so I really hope that it's the same case for the S22 Ultra as well. So definitely something I'm looking forward to. Of course, there are going to be many more camera comparisons that are going to come out soon enough, and you know, with the new flagships and everything. So definitely stay tuned for those. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button, it will help me out a lot. Of course, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be seeing you guys later. Cheers.